first Angevin Talks of Michaelmas. To tell you a little bit about the Angevin Talks, for those who are new here, the Angevin Talks is an innovative speaker series hosted at Queen's College, Cambridge, where Miss Owen selects the most inspiring individuals of our time to share their experiences and discuss critical issues facing our society today. So I hope you all enjoy the evening and the talk. And now over to you.
Thank you very much, Sneha. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and a warm welcome to you all for this Angevin talk, where we find ourselves in this very special and historic building we all call Old Hall. This is the original dining hall at Queen's, and it was erected as part of the original college in 1448. We have many esteemed guests joining us this evening, heads of house from other colleges, our Queen's alumni, Queen's fellows, fellows of the Illyrian Institute for Behavioral Economics, and members of MCR and JCR. Thank you all for being here. It is now my great honor to introduce and welcome our very special guest, Owen Matthews, who very generously flew in from Rome to join us this evening. Owen is a distinguished British historian and journalist, born in London, and educated at Christ Church, at the other place. Owen, a very special welcome. You have had an illustrious career as bureau chief, Moscow and Istanbul for Newsweek. You've covered every notable conflict in Afghanistan, Lebanon, Iraq, to name but a few. You are also currently Russia correspondent for Spectator magazine and a frequent commentator on BBC, NPR, NBC, and CNN, and author of 9 books that have been translated into 32 languages. You are the author of this exceptional and very substantive book called Overreach, a fascinating account of the inside story of Putin's war on Ukraine, and winner of the Pushkin House Prize this year. Congratulations and a very warm welcome. And you wrote this book in the first 6 months of the war, and at the outset of Overreach, you write the following: the definition of a great conflict is that it results in the breaking of nations and reordering of the world. By that measure, the Russo-Ukraine war is the most serious geopolitical crisis in Europe since the Second World War, and one which will result in far greater global consequences than 9/11. I'm quoting Owen. The world's security architecture, food and energy supply, balance of military power and alliances will be forever altered by it. And of course, since October 7th, we now have an additional layer of immense conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas. You are half Russian, a native Russian speaker, have family ties in both Russia and Ukraine, and you know Ukraine and Russia intimately. Can you please share a little of your family background with us?
Well, firstly, thank you enormously for the invitation. I think I've been slightly overbilled. I'm not one of the most inspiring individuals of our times, but I'm glad to say I actually have met several of them. And in fact, later this month, I'm seeing one of them, in fact, again in Kiev, which is Vladimir Zelensky. But we'll get to discussions about him in a moment. But yes, my mother is Russian from Kharkiv, which used to be a non-controversial statement. But actually, that's when she was born in 1934, and she's still with us, Kharkiv was, of course, the capital of Soviet Ukraine. And her family, for several generations, going back a couple of hundred years, were also Russians who had considered themselves loyal servants of the Tsar. One of my, including as Governor General of Kiev and so on. So basically, there is no doubt that the relationship between Russia and Ukraine is an imperial one. And by the way, there's nothing more boring than other people's family story, but the only people that histories. But the reason I mention that story in my book is because it's not an entirely straightforward imperial relationship as Britain, for instance, had with India. It's much more intimately intertwined, like England and Scotland, for instance, or England and Ireland. And the measure of that is, for instance, that actually throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, you had essentially interchangeable elites, just as you had in England and Scotland. You know, the prominent people from Ukraine would go to St. Petersburg, rule the Russian Empire, and vice versa. So in that sense, it's a sort of familial conflict rather than a neighborly conflict. And that's actually what makes, it's that human factor that makes it extraordinarily complicated on an emotional level for most Russians and most Ukrainians, because it's very hard to find a Russian who has no Ukrainian ties in their extended family and vice versa.
So, Owen, at the heart of this conflict, you say, is a mystery. What do you mean by that? From a Western point of view, this invasion made no sense. But you have very substantial insight inside the Kremlin. Why did Putin do it?
That he did it because he thought he could win it. I think that's the most, I mean, it sounds glib, but actually that's really the most basic. He thought that he could get away with it, and the reason why he got away with it is because he was told so, and he has no alternative sources of information. And that's, of course, the problem with information bubbles, which, by the way, are not entirely, and they're not exclusively confined to totalitarian regimes. I mean, I'm sure many of us have read Bob Woodward's fantastic book on the Planet of Attack. You see that actually, you know, you can have information bubbles even in advanced democracies. You know, you have a team of people who are feeding information that they think the boss wants to hear. And of course, in an autocracy like Russia's, you actually have a situation where Putin is surrounded by people who have an interest. He's surrounded by Ukrainians who have a direct vested interest, notably Viktor Kovalchuk, who is Yuri Kovalchuk, and who is has extensive business interests, and he's one of the people that actually spends time with Putin in his COVID bubble. You have Medvedchuk, who is also Viktor Medvedchuk, who is a prominent oligarch, and he's been Putin's man on the ground inside Ukraine for 2 decades, and he's been deputy prime minister and so on. He's a pro-Russian that's sort of intimately connected with the Ukrainian, the upper echelons of Ukrainian politics, and Medvedchuk hopes to be appointed president under a sort of Putin, a sort of quisling president. So, and you can go down the rather long list of people, but all of them from the sort of security establishment that have surrounded Putin and with whom he's worked for half a century. It's kind of an extraordinary circumstance in any leadership that actually the inner core of leaders, and I'm speaking particularly of Nikolai Patrushev, the head of the Security Council, and Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, they've actually literally worked with Putin and known him since the mid-1970s. I mean, it's extraordinary continuity. It's like a very, very tiny, tight circle of people. I mean, we laugh about the Bullingdon Club, but I mean, this is like, just goes far deeper and far and far longer. So, as you go down the list, you realize that actually Putin is just being surrounded by a sort of world of terrible information. And based on the information that he's been given, it's actually not a terrible idea to invade Ukraine, because he thinks, I mean, just to sort of skip through the 5 sort of major bullet points, he thinks that Europe is leaderless because Angela Merkel has stepped down. He thinks that Biden has been completely humiliated in Afghanistan and is never, will never have the sort of cojones or the leadership to actually stand up against Russia in an invasion. He thinks he knows. I mean, this part is actually true that President Zelensky's ratings are in the bin. He's bumping on at 30%. And he is convinced by people like Medvedchuk that the Russian invasion will be welcomed by by the Russian speakers of Ukraine with open arms. So he believes that if not now, then when? And he believes that he can just pull it off, because just as he had done so before in 2014, Putin, just like any other leader, believes that the future is going to be like the past. I mean, that is the basic sort of the currency of any decision making. You think that the thing that you did before is going to be achievable again. And he thinks, by that metric, that he's going to sort of essentially mount a massively armed, sort of aggravated coup against Zelensky to sort of knock out the leadership. I think it's pretty clear he doesn't intend to occupy Kiev, but he just needs to knock out the government, install a puppet regime. He thinks that he's going to get away with it with a land grab of quote-unquote Russian speakers, just as he had got away more or less scot-free in 2014 in February when he takes Crimea. And crucially, he thinks that the West is completely cynical. I mean, it's horrifying that he would think that, because guess what? In February 2014, when you go back and look at what Angela Merkel says, she says, this is horrific. We must not allow, never again, never in our time can we allow the outrage of forcible annexation in the territory of Europe. Like, fast forward, 15 months later, she's signing a €9 billion contract with Gazprom for Nord Stream 2. So it's not entirely surprising that Putin believes that the West's words are written in water and they're completely cynical.
But so his authoritarianism indeed seemed to harden in and around 2020, the pandemic hit, then his great essay in 2021. How do you think it developed, in your opinion? How did he, and Putin always, I guess, looked rational, a thinker, not this crazy risk taker. So can we talk about that a little bit, and in any which way you prefer to approach that?
Well, it's interesting because I mean many of us, by us I mean sort of commentators and people who have been writing about Putin, and I acknowledge that I'm guilty of this as well. We have just thought we've tended to cast Putin as this sort of extraordinarily sophisticated strategic thinker, whereas in fact actually what he has been is just a very lucky optimist, or rather lucky I think is actually giving him too little credit. What he's done is he's sort of chosen low-hanging fruit. He's chosen easy battles. So I mean an excellent example of this is Syria. So Syria, why does Putin go into Syria? People tend to forget actually the reason why he initially goes, there's a reason for him to escalate in Syria, because just after he goes into Syria in 2015, a Russian passenger plane is blown out of the sky in Sharm el-Sheikh. People forget about that, but actually, he has like sort of literally sort of skin in the game. Like Russian civilians' blood has been shed by, actually not by a Syrian group as it happens, but nonetheless. But in Syria, he goes into a war which nobody else really wants to go into. Obviously, the NATO is bombing Syria, there's air power involved. But he deploys one squadron of aircraft, it's like 36 planes. 2,130 ground crew. We know that because they published the election returns, so we know precisely how many people voted in the... But it's like this tiny deployment in a war that nobody else wants to deploy in. So he just gets to completely reverse the course of the Syrian civil war with 30 planes. Like, that's an extraordinarily important result, because in the circumstances of that war, it's a gun brought to a knife fight, and he wins it because no one else wants to do what he's doing. And similarly, in Crimea, it was a risk. It was a mad risk. But actually, it was at a moment when there was like complete chaos. The government of Ukraine had just, had just been, hadn't actually been toppled. It's a very common myth, very common among Russian leadership circles, that there was like a coup against president, the President Yanukovych, Viktor Yanukovych. But in fact, the coup happened. The coup essentially happened only after he had fled, because the Europeans had done everything possible to keep Viktor Yanukovych in power in February of 2014, and were actually sort of trying to save his sorry backside. And actually, at that point, he actually gets in a motorcade and then eventually a helicopter and a plane and flees the country. So it's not even that there's been a coup, it's just that the government, the head of state, has just fled the country and there's no... So in fact, actually, Putin is a serial risk taker. But what makes us think that he's actually a brilliant strategist is the fact that all of his calculated risks have actually always sort of, in every roll of the dice has actually worked out. You know, and you just scroll that back, the same principle applies to Georgia in 2008. You know, he provokes Misha Saakashvili, who I know really quite well, and I'm sure you know him too, Bridget. I mean, he's a very unstable and strange character, but he was the Putin essentially provoked him into doing something unbelievably stupid, which was to attack Tsinghvali, the capital of South Ossetia, and then he just like piles in. So Putin has actually been a serial risk taker, and that's exactly the way to look at the Russian invasion. He thought that he could just get away with it. And the irony is that he actually, when you take the southern part of the operation, it worked absolutely perfectly. So what we tend to focus on is the stalled operation around Kiev, and we're talking about the very last days of February, beginning of March. They come within a whisker of taking Kiev. What goes wrong in Kiev, this is now just back to the tactics and just basic sort of back and forth of on-the-ground battles, is that they failed to secure the military airport, which they're going to use to pour in the airborne troops. And in fact, the Ukrainians not only managed to pin down the troops that have been sent to take that airport just outside Kiev, it's called Hostomel, but also shoot 2 transports full of paratroops out of the sky. And all the rest of the flight turns back. And that's how they save Kiev. And then there's fighting around Kiev. There's unexpected resistance. Russia does not take Kiev. That part of the operation goes wrong. But the southern part goes exactly right. The defenses between the Crimean Peninsula and Kherson Oblast are down. A swathe of local officials from Kherson to Novokakhovka to Melitopol are successfully bribed. Within 4 hours, which is basically exactly how long Google Maps will tell you it takes to drive from Crimea to Novokakhovka, they literally just drove down the highway. In 4.5 hours, the Russian flag was flying over the Novokakhovka dam. They surrounded Kherson. Kherson ends up negotiating, giving up without a fight. So in fact, actually, the whole operation, as planned, basically from the rebel republics of the Donbass all the way to the Dnieper and all the way to Kherson, just basically falls without a fight, and it would have been absolutely perfect. And had Putin stuck to that, done only that, then I think the Western response would have been dramatically different. And the overreach, as described in certain books on the subject, the overreach comes because he takes that one step too far. It's like the one fatal thing that he does that messes it all up, and that he decides to go at Kiev and fails. I mean, it's now impossible to know whether, had he actually taken downtown Kiev, what would have happened, or what Zelensky's reaction would have been. But again, he believes that the future is going to be like the past. He thinks that Zelensky is going to cut and run exactly as Yanukovych cut and run. I mean, the Ukrainian presidents have got form of doing precisely that. So he thinks that whether that would have happened or not, I'm not sure. But the overreach part was that he just sort of ratcheted up his operation just a little bit too far. And I think he would have actually got away with it if he just stuck to the Russian-speaking, well, I was going to say quote-unquote Russian-speaking, but actually they literally are Russian-speaking areas of the south and east of the country.
So Zelensky, just for a second, and then we'll go back to Putin. You go into extraordinary detail. I mean, This is the most fascinating on-the-ground account. You've got interviews of people, the hardships, the difficulty, people didn't want to speak to you. It is an incredible book and gives us all the insight that you just would never be able to see or know about without your knowledge and inside view. But US intelligence, everybody was telling Zelensky this was coming down, and he didn't believe it. I mean, you know, everybody, foreign state, everybody was talking to him. And what do you think, what was it about Putin that Zelensky did not think he was going to take that extra step? Or why did everyone make that miscalculation?
Well, I have to say, as a spirit of full disclosure, I also was among those people that didn't think it was going to happen. I actually, in common with lots of members of the Russian elite, because he was doing, and in fact I wrote a piece in the Daily Mail not saying he wouldn't do it. What I was saying, the piece slightly, it didn't age well, but my piece in the Daily Mail said, like, Putin would be crazy to invade at this point because he's actually doing so well with his heavy metal diplomacy. You know, 2 days before, like, people tend to forget, it all just got lost in the mix and the Sturm und Drang that followed. But literally, Macron offered Putin a sit-down conference to discuss the security architecture of Europe. I mean, the kind of, you know, with all the European leaders. I mean, that's exactly what Putin really wants. That kind of like big thing, the big grandstanding. It's like pure victory, right. Diplomatic victory for Putin. So like the point of a threat is that it has to be credible. So you can actually, if no one is going to be scared by your rattling the saber, right. If you just rattle it, and everyone knows that you're rattling it. It has to be actually credible. So that was why when you have the mobile field units with like sort of plasma coming up to the front lines and the mobile crematoria. I mean, there's all this like sort of crazy avalanche of signals intelligence coming out from the Americans suggesting that the Russians are very serious about this. But on the other hand, like aren't they actually just bigging themselves up and actually making everyone terrified that they're actually going to do it? In order just to sort of push home that big diplomacy, because I mean there was also a very fundamental, I think, disconnect on a diplomatic level between the demands that Lavrov was basically given by the presidential administration, which were barely on the radar of a reasonable diplomatic document, because diplomats tend to operate within sort of rather well-defined yes, what's it called? Sorry, the opportunity sphere. Anyway, it'll come to me in a second. But but with various defined parameters, what has been talked about, what is possible, and so on. And and this was just completely left field. I mean, what Putin was demanding was essentially the NATO rollback to sort of pre-2007 levels. I mean, it was and basically sort of de-NATOize the whole swathe of NATO. I mean, it was completely unworkable. Nonetheless, people, I think, really I mean, I don't think I know, having spoken to people in the cabinet office who were trying to sort of crunch their way through all of this, what does Putin actually really want? Clearly, it's an over-ask. He's like asking for something, mad, but nonetheless, what he can really be. And the French think they've cracked it. And after that conversation that Macron, he has actually filmed like sort of high-fiving and dancing around, and like he's completely delighted. He thinks he's given Putin that sort of the get out that he wants. And then ultimately it turns out that Putin actually was planning to do the full Monty all along.
But he kept it very quiet, and
unbeknown
very strategic.
to his foreign minister,
right.
Known to only 5 people in the room in that infamous Security Council meeting. Only 5 of his inner cabinet knew. All the rest had different ideas, but like only the very inner core knew the full extent of the military plans.
So when Macron said that Putin came out months later that Putin should not be humiliated. He received a lot of pushback. So was he correct in saying that? And how do you interpret that in terms of sort of the ultranationalism stance of Russia, and what is Macron worried about when he says that, in terms of making it a tipping point into something that's much worse?
Well, I think we need to divide the war into phases, and one of the ways that we can divide the war into phases is it's the Overton window. That was the phrase I was thinking of. The Overton window, okay. the maximum scope of what is possible or achievable is the Overton window. And it's an interesting concept to think of the West's attitudes towards Russia in the first phase of the war. Because among the entirely realistic possibilities for Russian action was, were this to go very wrong, that Putin would use tactical nuclear weapons. And that was actually a far more important consideration, actually. I happen to know, I mean, I think there are people here who are in a position to know even more than I do, but nonetheless, I know, having spoken to some very senior current and former NATO commanders, that was a much more important consideration in strategic circles and in military and NATO than it actually was in the public discourse, that actually people in senior military levels took that very seriously. Because the problem is with your tactical nuclear weapons use, there's many problems with it, but the major problem is that the rules are not written for the use of tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, we just think that, we tend to think in terms of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but in fact, actually, what the very smallest tactical nuclear ever created, it was 0.07 kilotons, the equivalent of 70 tons of TNT. It's in 155 millimeter NATO artillery shells, the size of a Coke bottle. It's the smallest ever nuke ever created. So, so what do we do if Putin does that? What do we do if Putin he doesn't even need to use or deploy a tactical nuclear weapon? He just needs to rip up the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which is now done, and just blow up a nuke in the White Sea, in Mitushina Bay, up in Novaya Zemlya. He doesn't even need to nuke anybody apart from himself. He can do that. And what do? We're in a new world. So the point is, when we talk about, when Macron is talking about not humiliating Putin, he's actually, I think, talking about not escalating the war. Right. And he's talking about the nuclear aspect. And actually, that apparently egregious sort of, appeasement, realpolitik argument that annoyed the Ukrainians justifiably so much, is of a piece with, for instance, General Mark Milley, as we know from the brilliant reporting of the Washington Post, who've done a very good sort of TikTok of the actual sort of chain of briefings that General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in America, gave, starting from the beginning of the end of October of 21, and he's briefing Biden on the very detailed information that they're getting on the build-up. And in Milley's first presentation, like his number one bullet point is, how do we deal with this situation in Russia while avoiding a kinetic war with the Russian Federation? That's consideration number one. And that consideration actually it's important to remember that as we now move forward into the final sort of closing sort of agony of the war, is that actually ultimately from the get-go, the American position was not to help Ukraine win. They never said that. I mean, they've subsequently said things that are similar to that. We must give Ukraine everything possible that they need to win. That phrase probably has come out. But actually, right from the get-go, the clearest statement of US policy was probably Biden's speech in Warsaw, I think it was in May 2022, where he says, we will do everything possible to get Ukraine and Zelensky into the best position of the negotiating table. He's like, during negotiations. It's right there, built in, right at the beginning, is negotiation. So, and that, as I'm sure we'll come to this in more detail, but that's basically going to be one of the sort of train wreck moments as we approach the end game of this war, is that the Ukrainians actually believe, or have been led to believe, that we, the collective West, are in it so that they can actually kick the Russians entirely out of their country. But that's A, never really been the plan, and B, that concern about the use of tactical nukes has never gone away, has never disappeared. It's receded because, as I said, we need to divide this into phases. The first stage of the war, the kinetic war, you actually have, which basically runs until October, from February to October of 22. So you have the Russians, Russians invade the south, they invade the north, they get kicked out of the north, then they get kicked out of quite significant swathes of territory around Kherson and Kharkiv, and then at that point, basically from October, there's a little bit of positional fighting. There's Bakhmut is taken by the Russians, Avdiivka is about to fall to the Russians, sorry about that, but that's going to happen. You have the summer account, basically you from October of 22 until now, for the last year, you have the second phase of the war, which is essentially like a stalemate. And very significantly, as you will have read, Valery Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, admitted that. In The Economist, he wrote a very important, strange, I don't know why he did that, but nonetheless, we can park that. Why? But what he said was, there is not going to be a big, beautiful breakthrough. And he essentially admitted that the defeat in the summer offensive. They're $60 billion in, and they took 9 kilometers of territory on a 1,300 kilometer front. So that was not a great result.
So I have a question, because I've been very fascinated over the last months with Prigozhin. So a little bit of insight on the workings of the mercenaries, the relationship with Putin, and what really triggered Prigozhin to turn on Moscow, turn around, and then become essentially, as you've written so very clearly, a dead man walking. And he didn't actually think he was a dead man walking. So for somebody that should and ought to have been as paranoid as he was walking around Moscow, I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yes. Yes, Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator, he was so impressed. He said, you wrote in the current magazine that Prigozhin is dead man working, and now he's like dead. I said, well, it's not a sort of Nostradamus league. This is not, it was not the most extraordinary prediction that one can make. So, but I think that there's three really significant things about the whole Prigozhin story. Firstly, and most importantly, and this is actually enormously important for the end game of the war, Prigozhin was useful to the Kremlin because he was able to collect an army of expendables. Now, a war that you fight with an army of expendables, like the sort of the scum of the earth, as Wellington said of his own troops at Waterloo, the scum of the earth that you've cleaned out of your prisons, that's not a very important war to you. You're not sending your brightest and best, you're sending the worst. You're essentially just using your prison population as a sort of bullet sponge on the front lines. Right. As the Ukrainians call it, the meat waves that are attacking Avdiivka. It wasn't really, of course, the fact that Prigozhin has this long-standing sort of corrupt relationship with the presidential administration and with the army, and he's been making money off army, catering supplies. That's just corruption. We all know that that's happened. But the whole point of actually, using this literal criminal to assemble an army of criminals, and then arm them heavily and send them to the front lines and have them all massacred. What could possibly go wrong? And surprisingly, it does go wrong in the entirely predictable way. It's the army of heavily armed criminals that you've just formed actually to decide that they're unhappy. And anyone who knows the history of the Russian Civil War, which was, by the way, precisely referenced by Putin on that very alarming and strange speech on the first day of the Prigozhin rebellion. This is exactly what happens. This is how civil wars start. You lose control of the monopoly of violence, which is the basic prerequisite of any nation state. You farm it out. So, but your question is about what. I don't think ultimately Prigozhin's life and death is actually very significant to the war effort. I mean, he was just useful. He was just it was just tactically helpful. And now the defense ministry has now actually formed its own prisoner battalions and is now recruiting still as much as it ever was in prisons. And in that sense, he just sort of sank without trace. And the Prigozhin way of recruitment just continues to be the way that Russia recruits a significant chunk of their manpower.
But what did Putin say to Prigozhin in order for him to stand down and turn around? And why did Prigozhin believe him? Because essentially he broke his word. Not that that's surprising, but
he broke his word.
What is this is somebody that was his right hand and front line and kept his powder dry for so long.
What did Putin promise him? Well, he promised him his life, and he promised him that he probably promised him that the Russian army would cease and desist shelling Wagner, which is considered to be not okay by Wagner for obvious reasons. The thing I don't we don't know, but but it is significant that Putin broke his word. So in fact, there was a lot of debate and excitement about this, about the whole incident. But I mean, one of the interesting things that Prigozhin shows is, of course, that Russia is a totally failed state.
Right.
I mean, not just because of the franchising of the monopoly of violence, which is clearly a sign that Putin's security state is not adequate to the task of fighting a war, but also the fact that you have a sort of personal corrupt relationship between the head of state and this guy who's literally a criminal and a mercenary. There's lots of metrics by which the Prigozhin story shows that the society is broken. You have this glorification of these, and by the way, they were just very serious criminals. I mean, they're not just sort of shoplifters. Right. They were actually literally multiple rapists and murderers. I mean, they were actually really people who were in for
and in every country in Africa, overrunning the governments, taking 85% of all the assets in the mining.
Yes, but that part, the sort of the colonial part, actually is actually a rather long-standing story, because that's exactly what the French Foreign Legion has been doing in Francophone Africa for ever since the World War II, actually. And the French Foreign Legion is actually also an army of expendables, by the way. That's the whole reason why it's founded, because you have people desperate enough to sign up and fight for money. But the unusual thing is that you actually incorporate it into your own country and also make them heroes. Right. So there were stories of these rapists and murderers who are going to lecture school children. I mean, it was a completely appalling. I mean, there's many ways in which modern Russia is completely sort of distressingly dysfunctional. But the Prigozhin was like the acme. You just couldn't imagine anything. If you read that in a work of fiction, you would think it was ridiculous. But it happened.
But I just don't even know why Prigozhin was happily walking around Moscow and thinking nothing was going to happen to him. It's very interesting that there's all these strategic mistakes by both of them in very in different ways.
Well, actually, actually, the most significant way in which Prigozhin demonstrates that Russia is a failed state is that it shows that Russia does not work by the rule of law, but what the Russians call понятия, which means understandings. And понятия is also, by the way, a criminal world piece of jargon that's been borrowed into the mainstream of the Russian language. But it's understandings between mates are much more important than the rule of law. And actually that's the whole Prigozhin story, before, during and after, is purely a story of понятия, is that actually Prigozhin misunderstood the понятия. He sort of, and that was why he was blown out of the sky.
Can we turn for a minute to Zelensky before we get on to sort of the next steps? What has made him, in your opinion, such an effective leader when his ratings were at 30% popularity at the beginning of the war? Everybody was, being kind of quite derogatory about him, and he has stepped up into this powerful Churchillian almost leader.
Well, the answer to that is very simple. Is that he's personally impressive, and he actually has an amazing communications team. I mean, the whole Zelensky story is a relatively rare in world politics example of the government of a country being taken over by a television production company. That's literally true. That's totally true. Everyone who works in the presidential administration all worked for 95 Kvartal, including his Andrei Yermak, who's the major, who basically is the de facto prime minister of Ukraine and big executive, is an entertainment lawyer.
Right, but these were his people, and he trusts them all.
Right.
Number one.
So in that sense, it's actually not an incredibly healthy. And in fact, I mean, obviously, I slightly hesitate to make this comparison because it's offensive, but basically, it's the same kind of thing Putin did. He just took all the peeps that he had been working with for 30 years and just brought them in and gave them all the jobs. Right. Which is, again, like, not incredibly democratic. However, in this particular case, it actually turned out to be actually, a very good way to run the government and very effective. And I think that there was the thing that I think really sort of cut through was firstly his personal bravery, in marked contrast to his two predecessors, Petro Poroshenko. And Poroshenko, and also the fact that actually people, I think, believed that he was actually honest. Whereas Poroshenko was, a chocolate billionaire. I always wonder how you become a billionaire from chocolate, but apparently you can. He's literally a chocolate billionaire, and I guess people eat a lot of chocolate. And of course Yanukovych, who was conspicuously, egregiously, I mean, even by Ukrainian standards, he blew the doors off. I mean, nobody had ever been, even in Ukraine, as corrupt as Yanukovych was. So, and his son was the second richest person in the country. I mean, it was completely outrageous and egregious. So there was, people thought that actually, that he was honest. But the reason why his ratings were in the dumps was actually a really interesting reason, and it's something that actually is enormously significant for the end game of this war, and it's something that everyone has totally forgotten. And that is the events of October 2019. And just to remind you, because you may have forgotten, just along with the rest of humanity, is that actually in October 2019 there was a deal on the table to reincorporate the rebel republics of the Donbass. And it was essentially like Minsk II, but the sticking point of Minsk II was, who would supervise a vote in the rebel republics of the Donbass? Would it be Ukrainian election monitors, like obviously non-starter because they're rebel republics, clues in the name, or is it the OSCE, so like sort of Norwegians and Swedes? So finally, they get to the point of it's going to be the OSCE, it's the Steinmeier formula for like diplomatic nerds. Anyway, and this is all going to happen. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is going to supervise elections in the rebel republics, and they're going to vote not on whether to join Russia or not to join Russia, but whether to rejoin Ukraine on status quo ante terms or on special status quo terms. Like, obviously, they're going to vote for the latter. So, essentially, Ukraine is now going to become a federal state, which is not the worst outcome in the world. I mean, why not? There's lots of federal states in the world, and they seem to be okay, like Switzerland, etc. But anyway, the point is that this extremely smart and obvious formula, which Zelensky has been personally working on for months, and it's what he's promised. Zelensky is elected in April of 2019 on the promise. Zelensky is the pro-Russian candidate. Everyone forgets this. He's the pro-Russian candidate. He speaks Russian at home. They still speak Russian in the cabinet and the Security Council, by the way. And it's like a big secret, but that's their language. They all speak Russian to each other because they're Russophones. And Zelensky is the candidate that actually is massively supported by the voters in the East, the Russian, because they think that he's finally going to restore parity of Russian language speakers' rights. I mean, whatever. But he's definitely sort of not head-banging Ukrainian nationalist like Poroshenko was. That's the secret of his success. That's why he gets 71% of the vote back in April. And but when push comes to shove in October of 2019, he's been working on this deal and, heal Ukraine. Okay, Crimea is gone, but like he's literally about to implement this whole new constitutional revolution, starting with the vote in Donbass. And Azov come out on the streets. There's like essentially something very close to a coup, or it's definitely a threatened coup. I mean, it's overtly threatened. So Azov, there's a series of right-wing battalions who are notionally part of the Ukrainian armed forces. Electorally, the far right, the people with the wolf's angle on their as their battle flag, the wolf's angle being the battle flag that the Azov shares with the 2nd SS Panzer Division. I just put that out there, but anyway, these people are electorally insignificant. There's only one far-right candidate in the Rada out of 450. Electorally, they're nowhere. But on the street, there are a lot of people who are angry and are violent and armed, and they literally say, we're going to do another Maidan. And if you compromise with the rebel republics, then we're going to literally take control of the streets of Kiev and kick you out. And the whole thing dissolves, and there is no vote, and the conflict continues. So, and that's the reason why Zelensky's electoral fortunes start to erode very clearly, because he's not able to deliver any kind of real results for the Russian speakers, and he's not able to deliver peace. And honest or dishonest people by that point don't really care, because they just think he's ineffective.
How did he mobilize the entire country behind him? Not that it's a big far-fetched thing, because ultimately everybody wants to be independent, they want a democratic society, this is Ukraine. But what was it about his own personal charisma, you think, that actually it's not divided, it's very much behind him?
Well, the point about his personal charisma was that he had it. But there's a more important element, or like a question that can be asked here, and that is, to what extent did Vladimir Putin create this outcome? So let's just do a thought experiment. Like, let's say Putin had not attacked Kiev. Well, let's say Putin had not done the northern Operation North, to use a phrase from Barbarossa. But what if he had just done the south? Right. Would Zelensky have been a hero? Would Boris Johnson have sort of rushed to his side? I mean, it's I think, crucially, there would have been a very different reaction in Ukraine as well. But the fact that their capital was attacked meant that there's no Ukrainian, Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking, no one is going to put up with that, apart from sort of the most extreme sort of collaborator and sort of Russophiles. But that's a very tiny constituency. And in fact, overtly pro-Russian parties are also electorally basically have close to insignificant in the current Rada, the Rada elected in June of 2019. So yes, Zelensky is important, but also the ridiculous thing. It's not the tragic thing, but actually, technically speaking, in the sort of ancient Greek sense of tragic, is someone that actually is the cause of their own downfall. Putin is amazingly good at creating the precise outcome that he's trying to avoid. He invades Ukraine in order to keep it out of NATO. Good. That worked very well. It's a stop NATO expansion. Also, not
the best thing that ever happened to NATO.
And furthermore, he's to destroy Ukrainian statehood. Not so. Obviously, he achieved the precise opposite. So in that sense, it was just the egregious nature of the invasion that actually helped Zelensky at that moment unite all Ukrainians, because that was just so extraordinarily over the top. It was such an idiotic piece of overreach that Zelensky was not only able to unite his people, but also very quickly able to rally the West unequivocally, right at the beginning. I mean, even Viktor Orban, by the way, condemned it at the beginning. I mean, now he's changed his mind somewhat, but I mean, right at the beginning, there was just no question. Like, Putin has just screwed the pooch epically. Like, that is not something that's acceptable to anybody. Even China doesn't accept it. I mean, the Chinese are completely shocked as well. And
I have a question with you about China in a moment, but what is the best case scenario here for a realistic end game? In your book you say, as the story is incomplete, though we have no idea how exactly the conflict will end, we already know how it will not end. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. So this is where we talked about trigger warnings with Anna. We're about to get depressing, I'm sorry to say. But I really am sorry to say. And by the way, I should add the proviso is that actually I very much hope that I'm wrong in what I'm about to say. But to me, I think it's actually pretty devastatingly obvious what the end game of the war is going to be. Because I think, let's take it from the Ukrainian side. Ukraine has not had the material that it needs for a breakthrough, but much more strategically importantly, it doesn't have the men. The manpower is becoming, and it's clear from Zaluzhny's writings over the last few weeks, is that actually they just don't have the manpower to achieve a significant breakthrough against the Russians. So there's actually no realistic chance, I think, of a Kherson or a Kharkiv-style collapse. And let's say even if that happens, it's probably going to be in an area that's actually not the Donbass. So, but the long and the short of it is that there is going to be a significant territorial loss for Ukraine. I think that's an inevitability. And currently, the looming train wreck for Ukraine and its statehood and its politics is that two things, apparently paradoxical things, are going to happen. One is that there is going to be a ceasefire sooner or later along a line of control, and at the same time, no Ukrainian leader, not Zelensky nor anybody, can sign up to a land for peace deal and survive. It's totally politically unsurvivable for any Ukrainian leader to do that. Ukraine instantly becomes ungovernable overnight. You have 7 million internally displaced people, you've got hundreds of thousands, you've got 700,000 veterans who spilled blood for this land. This is, that cannot happen. So somehow you have those two, you have to square those two incompatible things. There already are some voices, notably one of my favorite Ukrainian politicians, Vadim Pristaiko, who's Zelensky's first foreign minister and was ambassador in London, a very smart guy. Pristaiko was fired as foreign minister in October of 2019 for saying, if Donbass doesn't want to be Ukrainian, let them not be Ukrainian. Nothing good will ever come to Ukraine of reincorporating Donbass. Like, just it needs to be cut off like a gangrenous limb, unsayable then. Right. But actually, I'm sorry, I think he's basically right. And Pristaiko, and then very controversially, at the end of August, just a couple of months ago, Alexei Arestovich, who's been a very prominent spokesman of the Zelensky administration, and was recently fired as a Zelensky advisor, said, if the loss of Crimea and Donbass is the price we pay for EU and NATO membership, that is a cheap price to pay. So, and the third thing is that the third problem with Zelensky's stated war aim of regaining 1991 borders, is that nobody speaks for, people ignore the agency of the people of Donbass and Crimea. Right. We don't know what they think. We don't. I mean, they're but I think I think the major problem is that essentially, I've been to Donbass in 2014 and 2015. I didn't meet a single person who was pro-Kiev. I spoke to hundreds of people. I was there for 2 weeks. I didn't meet anyone who was pro-Kiev. And people was like sort of, vaguely, regretful about the war. Some of the people, they had different political opinions. What they didn't want to do is be ruled by Kiev again. So the point was that already as early as 2014, it was really devastatingly clear that partition has already happened. Right. You know, the Muslims went left, the Hindus went right. It was bloody, it was ugly, but it happened. So the reality on the ground is that for the people who are still in Donbass, millions were displaced, millions don't agree, but the people who are still in Donbass, particularly in the rebel republics and the people who are still in Crimea, would regard a Ukrainian advance not as a war of liberation, but as a war of conquest and compulsion. So that becomes a really important and terrible existential problem for Ukraine. Because are you, as Zelensky, going to ask people to send their kids to fight and die to compel people to be Ukrainians who do not wish to be Ukrainians? I mean, that's a really terrible moral problem. But at the same time, if you don't do that, then Putin wins. That's the appalling paradox, because there is a catastrophic moral hazard in allowing Putin to end up with a chunk of territory. And that's another fundamental contradiction of the end of the war. But taking the Russian side for a moment, the Russians are just, they were, I think, genuinely nervous about the summer offensive. They feared that the reason that's why they built, why they sowed 10 million mines and built minefields 3 miles deep and so on, because they're afraid of a Kherson-Kharkov style September-October breakthrough. It didn't happen. They contained the Ukrainians, and the key thing is that sanctions didn't work. Basically, they just completely ignored sanctions. They're absolutely fine. The oil price is high. You will have seen the IMF just upgraded the growth forecast of Russia from 1.2% to 2.5%, which is, we in Britain, cannot even dream of. Right? In the current budget, Putin has allocated $110 billion to defense and security spending. That's just the open part of the budget for 2024. Now, that's about 9% of his GDP, compared to 3.5% that he was spending before the war on defense and security. It's expensive, but it's affordable. And compare it to like 40% that the Soviet Union was spending on the military-industrial complex at the end of the Cold War. It's, they can just continue. They've not had to do general mobilization, and also crucially, if they're downplaying the war, if you think if you think their war is important, you don't downplay it. There was, and if you read our extraordinary, very talented and brave colleague Steve Rosenberg's press, if you see his press reports, where is the war in the Russian press? Like page 3, page 5. And I've been in Moscow 3 times since the beginning of the war. People don't talk about it. There's recruitment posters, but it's been very deliberately kept under the radar. Moscow is just, the restaurants are packed, the nightclubs are packed, the theaters are packed, people are sort of jolly, they're tuning into conversations in cafes. No one's talking about the war. There's literally zero impression. You have absolutely no idea that you're in the capital of the country that is fighting the biggest war of the 20th century. It just does not exist for Muscovites. They're just in deep denial. Which is not to say that there actually isn't profound effects in Russia and of sanctions, and for a large section of the middle class, it was disaster. They left the country, but quite a lot of those people have now come back, by the way. But Russia is fine, but Ukraine is obviously not fine. So let's say that even if Zelensky gets his way and Zaluzhny gets his way, and they get their M16, so their F-16s, and their latest generation of Wunderwaffe, whatever it may be, the whole war has been punctuated by a whole series of demands for the next Wunderwaffe. It starts with NLAWs and javelins, and then it goes through, to the M777s, and then the HIMARS, and then the ATACMS, and the Leopards, and the F-16s. There's always some Wunderwaffe that is actually going to win the war for Ukraine, and conversely, the absence of that Wunderwaffe was why we lost. There's just a constant sort of, but actually the F-16 is a platform, by the way. Lockheed Martin developed it in 68, 67, and it's completely meaningless to get F-16s. It's all about the avionics. It's like a 55-year-old platform. It depends what's in the platform. In modern aerial warfare, it's the aircraft with the longest with the longest range, with the longest radar range and the longest missile range that wins. It doesn't matter what platform it's on. But the point is that Russia can just continue to fight and fight and fight.
But what you're talking about right here is what David Miliband, whom we've had the benefit of chatting to in one of these talks, he calls it the age of impunity, where a rogue state like Russia, there's no accountability. They can do what they want. Where does this go now, next? How do we wake up one day and figure out there's a ceasefire for them? And I guess the real question is that US support here to Ukraine is imperative, and the US needs to remain resolved to help them. Otherwise, there's no effort on Ukraine's, there's no way Ukraine can go. So what does this mean with the US? And what does the conflict in the Middle East now mean for Ukraine?
Yes, I mean, the end game of this war, I think, is that Putin, I think, in his mind has already won. He already had his party back in September when he celebrated the annexation of those territories. What happens from now on in is details for Putin. I don't think he really, he might want to, doesn't really care about Bakhmut, Avdiivka. I mean, it's all just bits and pieces. What's important for him is not whether this town or that town in Donbass is Russian or Ukrainian. That doesn't matter. The missing piece, I think, for Putin is his big deal with Washington and Beijing.
Right.
He wants to do his big deal. But that's not going to happen until the US presidential elections. So, as Michael McFaul, a former Obama advisor and US ambassador to Moscow, pointed out, there's literally zero incentive for Putin to do anything until he knows the results of the next presidential elections in the US. So, like nothing significant is going to happen between now and February 25. And then there's going to be a ceasefire. So, but the thing is that despite a radical difference in approach and rhetoric, the deal that Biden's going to do and the deal that Trump is going to do is the same deal. There's no difference. There's no other deal to be done.
Do you really believe that?
Yes,
I think if Trump comes along, Ukraine is toast.
Well, yeah, no, but the thing is, it's partition and security guarantees short of NATO membership and EU membership. That's the deal. So, and partition along the line of control. There's no other deal to be done. But the wild card is China, because I think actually China needs to come in to secure, to give security guarantees on to everybody. So basically what you're looking at is basically a sort of rewriting of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, except this time with China as, I mean, obviously they're party pre because they're, somewhat, because they're allied, but not very closely allied, nonetheless, aligned with Russia more than anyone else. But I think that I don't really see any other realistic outcome, because I mean, and when you say that it's important for Ukraine to support to continue, and how does the Middle Eastern war change that? Well, I think when you lose the headlines, you lose the support, but the loss of support was already happening before the war, before the Hamas attack, and already you have a steady erosion in Europe. You've got the Croatian, the Croats, the new president of Slovakia. You've got Viktor Orban. You've already got quite Ukraine skeptic measures in Poland. They banned the import of Ukrainian grain and so on. I mean, clearly the tectonic plates are shifting. The pranksters, the guys who pranked Giorgia Meloni last month, they said, well, frankly, we're a bit bored of Ukraine. So, I think it's not because it's not war fatigue so much, is that it's a realization that, it's a sort of realization that the returns are diminishing. Let's say that what will Ukraine be able to achieve with more weaponry that it has not achieved with the weaponry that it already has? That's really the question. And there is one area which is actually becoming, I think, one of the more important strategic focus of the war. And it's not the sort of First World War sort of Somme-style sort of deadlock on the front lines. It's rocketry. So they're actually starting to belt, belt the bejesus out of each other rather effectively with long-range drones and cruise missiles. So in that sense, actually, like the sort of long-range rocket artillery, like ATACMS, or cruise missiles like Storm Shadows and Taurus. I mean, these things actually can strategically damage Russia and actually cause Russia pain much more than a breakthrough. And everyone has been thinking in terms of a breakthrough. We're going to seize territory, and it's going to be, like sort of, the Battle of the Bulge or something. We're going to. But actually, I think that Ukraine has a much better chance of achieving parity, or rather, of actually sort of kicking Putin in the balls through rocketry and drones, which they're developing fast, and it's at that moment when actually Ukraine, the stalemate also becomes painful to maintain for Russia, that Russia also sort of comes to the negotiating table, because currently there's actually no appetite whatsoever, which is a problem for people say that that Ukraine is being forced to the negotiating table, but actually it's really not, because there's no real interlocutor, or certainly no real will or plan that is any way realistic from the Russian side.
So does Putin just stay in power
until he dies?
Until he dies?
Pretty much.
Notwithstanding all of the.
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, despite my friend Daniel Hannan. The infamous Daniel Hannan, the Brexit Daniel Hannan, often calls me for his deranged Telegraph columns and says Putin's about to fall, isn't he? And I say no, Dan, he's really not going to fall. And then I spend 20 minutes explaining to Dan why Putin is going to be just fine. And then the deranged column nonetheless comes out on the following day, and Telegraph's predicting and now finally the dictator is about to fall, the writings on the wall for the dictator. But I mean, actually, I don't really think that it is. I mean, and there's only one thing he has going for him, but it's a very big thing. And that is that his entire security state, dysfunctional Russian society, is completely grotesque. All this young artist who's just jailed for 6 years for exchanging the labels on supermarket goods as a sort of funny protest, and rapists that are let out on the front line. I mean, the whole thing is so profoundly corrupt. And so sort of grotesquely absurd, and so dysfunctional, and so based on corruption, and everything about it shouldn't work, except that the leaky barrel just has the leaky pail just has this stream of money pouring into it, and it can leak all it wants, but it's still going to be full. And the only way that the Putin regime actually really starts to hurt is the same reason why the Soviet regime, which also had its own sort of grotesque injustices and dysfunctions, but it only stopped working when the Saudis crashed the oil price at the request of Charlie Wilson, apparently, and co in 1983. And then in 2 years, the Soviet Union just sort of packs up and rolls over and leaves Afghanistan, and then dies. But it's just the oil price.
It's interesting because Putin thinks he's Russia. He's this tiny little, country, really, with a very small GDP in comparison to the world powers.
2% of the world's population, 2.5% of the GDP.
Right, and yet we are all sitting there, and he's going to be alive and well from what we're hearing, which is actually rather interesting. And what happens to Zelensky?
Well, Zelensky has actually already announced that he's not standing again for presidency, by the way, which is actually very honourable of him, and I think it's actually very smart of him to do that. The problem is that again, one of the many paradoxes that we discussed that faced Zelensky, I mean, that's a very unenviable job, I must say, is that at the same time he cannot claim democratic legitimacy and move along a sort of the biggest good news and lifeline that he's been given in the course of this entire war is the announcement of the EU candidacy. That's enormous for Ukraine, but he can't actually proceed very far with that without having elections. At the same time, the paradox is that the elections are going to be sort of massively acrimonious. And essentially someone's going to be to blame. And I can tell you immediately who is going to be to blame is going to be us, by the way. There's going to be like a major showdown. I mean, there's going to be sort of a major backlash against the West because we betrayed, we didn't, it was because we didn't provide enough that they lost the war. And in that sense, I think there's actually going to be, and there's actually maybe potentially a very strong electoral blowback against the EU, by the way. So, I mean, I think it's going to get terribly ugly in Ukrainian politics.
Well, my last question, because I know we have questions here, is that
got the questions
Lord
yet.
David Cameron's very first job as Foreign Secretary yesterday was to go and meet with Zelensky.
Yes.
What do you make of
He went on the magic train.
all of that? What do you make of
it's a rite of passage. You've got to go on the magic train. No, like Ursula von der Leyen, like Boris did it. It's just you've got to be in that office with the hero of the world. It's just sort of politicking. I mean, interestingly, when the full history is written of the war, the role of Boris, and by the way, Vadim Pristaiko, who was the Ukrainian ambassador at the beginning of the war here in London, and actually Boris's role in leading Europe into massive support was in fact enormously important, and actually brought the Europeans, but much more significantly the Americans, because I'm not sure that without his lead there would have been such immediate response. Although I mean that didn't actually have an immediate impact on the ground for some time, but nonetheless that political leadership was actually probably possibly the only significantly great thing that Boris Johnson ever did.
That's for you to say about Boris, because I don't think there's So thank you very much. That was fascinating and very informative. We appreciate it so much, and I know that there may be some questions in the audience. So, Ms. Neha, are you going to give?
Yes, we've got a few pre-submitted ones.
Well, do you want? Should we start with the ones in the room? Okay, amazing.
So it's a very painful discussion. I'm Russian by origin, so even my family, because of what happened. It's one of the most painful conversations that we've had in the last 2 years. What do you think? What changes the perception of the conflict? Because you write, you actually influence your readers. So what changes to the perception in society here in Europe could help people in Ukraine?
There's a really short answer to that, and that is that you have to decide whether, the really short answer is the truth hurts. So are you helping someone by encouraging them to pursue their delusion that, for instance, in this case, that Ukraine can reconquer all the territory that it's lost since 1991? I think that's a dangerous delusion, and also I think it's disastrous. I mean, why would Ukraine re-import those like vicious civil wars back into itself? There's 130,000 people from Donbass fighting on the Russian side, is the biggest single contingent by far, fighting against the Ukrainians. You're going to take all those people back into your country? How's that going to work? I mean, that's going to be a catastrophe. So are you helping the Ukrainians by encouraging that delusion for which they're fighting, or are you helping them by being honest? But the honesty actually essentially dictates that everyone that dies between now and the eventual sort of sordid ceasefire is dying for a mistake and for nothing. And that's also pretty devastatingly bleak. So as a journalist, I think, as a politician, that's a really difficult call to make. As a journalist, I think, I suppose most of the things I write are not really reports, they're sort of more analytical pieces. So, I mean, I just have to write what I believe to be true based on the facts, which is that actually Ukraine can still win the war, but only by redefining victory for itself. I think his current definition of victory, and this is actually the big sort of positive takeaway, by the way, sorry, is that actually it only loses if your definition of victory is regaining every inch of territory that you've got. But actually, you can win by, to live well is the best revenge. To actually have a successful society which actually, within its new borders is much more united than it ever would have been, by the way, before the loss of the sort of the Russian-speaking heartlands of the East. Prosperous, free, democratic inside Europe. That's an excellent result, and that is actually victory. Much more so than reincorporating these bloodlands which have been messing up your country for 30 years.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. You've talked about what...
Was there something I said?
No, unfortunately we've overrun.
I'm sorry.
And the group have got into this. So thank you very much for coming, Lucia. Thank you.
They literally ran out of the room after
It was our fault.
Sorry.
We overran a little bit, and there's a...
I was being cheerful. That was actually quite hopeful.
You talked about what you think the sort of geographical peace aspect looks like, but one of the other aspects of peace is just within familial relationships.
Yeah.
And within local areas about how families might have been divided down lines because one child lives in the Donbass, the other lives in Kyiv. Do you see places in the world that provide an example of how Ukraine can begin to coexist in that new world?
Well, the one thing that's actually unsayable, or rather, if you say it, it has to be massively qualified, is to compare it to Bosnia, because in fact there is to be clear, were it not for the Russian intervention, military intervention in Crimea and the interference in Donbass, Ukraine would not have split up. I'm sure that's the case. However, there is also, in parallel to that, a strong element of a civil war to this. I mean, that's real, and it was massively exacerbated by the interference of Russia. But nonetheless, you have a large proportion of the population, as I observed myself, in Donbass and Lugansk and so on, who are passionately hate Ukrainian nationalism and don't consider themselves to be Ukrainian speakers, or don't want to be ruled by Kiev or whatever. But the point is that that divide runs across families as well. Is there an example? Well, there's the only instructive diplomatic example. I realise I'm not answering your question, but the problem at the end game of this war is going to be you're faced with the same problem as the Dayton negotiators were faced. It's like, how do you deal with de facto ethnic cleansing? Because you can't return to a status quo ante. That's going to be the difficult part. In terms of the personal thing, I think that the hatred is so passionate. Yeah, and when you go to Kiev, I'm going to Kiev next week. The people have been so horrifically traumatized, and they've been. I don't see any kind of negotiations, any kind of reconciliation. And when I speak to Russians about this, in fact, including even yesterday, I had an interview with this Andrei Zorin, who's professor of Russian at Oxford. So Zorin said, "Well, when I was a kid, I didn't want to learn German." He was born in '56. I didn't want to learn German. I didn't want to go to German school because it was the language of the fascists. But actually, Russia did, in fact, reconcile itself to Germany after 10, 15 years. So I mean, but this is like a generational thing. I mean, the passions are understandably so deep, and especially on the Ukrainian side, because I think many Russians sort of glibly, because the war is not on their territory, they sort of glibly say like, we'll sort of kiss and make up. But I mean, they're not the Ukrainians. I mean, the hatred is, and the abida, like the hurt is so deep and profound. It's just going to take generations. They just hate the Russians get the guts so much.
Owen, on that very pleasant note, I know we've had a lot of your time, and I know it's getting late in the evening, and so I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. Owen, thank you for a fascinating discussion, very illuminating, and I thought I'd read a lot and learnt a lot in working on our talk today, but it's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you very, very much for being with us.
Thank you.